Out. Okay, welcome everyone. We may have a few more people join us as we get going, but since it's a little past the hour, I'm going to just get us started. So welcome, thank you all for joining us for Becky Hagenston's talk today. We are so excited to have her with us. I am just going to very briefly introduce Becky, and then I will hand things over to her to give her talk. And then we can do questions and discussion at the very end. Um, so without further ado, I will introduce very briefly Becky. Um, Becky Hagenson is a writer and professor of English at Mississippi State University. She is the author of 4 award-winning story collections, most recently The Age of Discovery and Other Stories, which won the Journal's Fiction Book Prize and was published by the Ohio State University Press in August 2021. Becky Hagenston grew up in Maryland and received an MFA from the University of Arizona and an MA from New Mexico State University. And so, without further ado, I will introduce Becky.
Hi. Oh my goodness. Mary and Kate and Dan. Oh my God, people I haven't seen in so long. All right, that's fantastic. Um, Thank you all for being here. And thank you, Rose and Kathleen, for thinking of me to do a talk. So I came to Marchutz by way of fiction writing. I moved to Tucson from Maryland when I was 24, with plans to get my MFA in fiction writing. Um, and it took me 3 tries and many years to get in. Um, and while I was doing that, and then while I was getting my MFA, I worked at the study abroad office, where I met Kathleen Keenan. And there we were, 2 secretaries getting our MFAs. And so we became great friends. And so when Kathleen ended up in X, of course, I had to go visit. um, so I'm going to share my screen in just a minute, and talk for like about 30 minutes about my time in X and my process and inspiration, how I turn my notes into stories, and then give a couple of examples of stories that got their start in France, and then tell you what I'm working on now. And then there'll be time for questions. So I'm going to try to share my screen. Let's see. Okay. All right. Can you see
Perfect.
that?
Yes.
All right. Some of you might recognize these places. Um, so I first visited X in 2006. And I've been back many times since, including in 2010 for sabbatical, when I was there for about 4 weeks. This is when I took these pictures. And Kathleen and Alan and John and the students were just so kind and generous and smart and inspiring. And I just learned a lot. I got to go to some of the lectures and go on some of the field trips. And I was able to go out into this field here. And I was just sitting there in the grass, trying to draw, and just noticing things that I hadn't really thought about before. And then I remember the color talk, really just kind of blowing my mind, thinking about how to combine things to get different shades, different types of grays. And then as a writer, I started thinking about how to combine different techniques and elements of fiction, like point of view and description and sentence syntax, to create mood and tone in fiction, which is sort of like a different type of shadow and light. So, all right, next slide. Okay. Um, let's see. Trying to go to the next slide. Hold on a second. What's going on here? Um, okay. All right, there we go. All right, got it. Um, so one of my favorite writers is James Baldwin, and I love this quote. Um, I remember standing on a street corner with the black painter Beaufort Delaney down in the village, waiting for the light to change. And he pointed down and said, "Look." I looked and all I saw was water. And he said, "Look again," which I did. And I saw oil on the water and the city reflected in the puddle. It was a great revelation to me. I can't explain it. He taught me how to see and how to trust what I saw. Painters have often taught writers how to see. And once you've had that experience, you see differently. And I could not agree with that more. And one of the ways that I try to capture what I see and what I'm learning to see is by taking notes, especially to get those details of place and setting. And speaking of setting, many of my stories take place in X, or one takes place in Arles and also in Nice, which is where my husband and I visited for a few days in 2010 when I was in France for that sabbatical. So I love this quote by Janet Burroway. If a character is the foreground of fiction, setting is the background. And as in a painting's composition, the foreground may be in harmony or in conflict with the background. So a lot of my stories start with character and setting, and then the conflict that comes from that combination. So when I'm traveling, I'm usually having a very pleasant time. But I don't really write about people having a very pleasant time. So I'm looking for the moments when something is unsettled or something's about to change or something's about to resist change. And I'm thinking about characters who are in conflict with their setting in some ways. And setting is especially important for the short story, at least in my stories, because they're pretty much grounded in one or maybe two places. And I'm writing 4 to 20-page stories, not 300-page novels. I'm just trying to capture a moment, and that moment takes place in a place. So the writer Robert Owen Butler says this about the short story. The short story will have you say to the reader, "Look, I don't have much time. So sit down. Let me tell you about a moment in this character's life when something took a turn or something intensified in some significant way." The short story will have oftentimes a brief sequence of causally linked events, but ultimately it turns on the moment. Um, so I try to start the story very close to that moment when something is going to change or intensify in some way. Um, and as a writer, I can't know, I can't know what's going to go on or what's going to happen when I start. I need to just plunge right in and start with a person and a place and a conflict, and then see where it takes me. And that means that I have to ask a lot of questions. So these are some of the things I need to figure out. Who is having a terrible time in this beautiful place? Why are they here? What do they want? What are they thinking but not saying? What conflicts can I throw at them? And what is going to make me keep writing? And I need to figure out the answers to those questions, and I need to also get to the setting through the senses. So I'm a big fan of Flannery O'Connor, and I love her book, Mystery and Manners. And she says, the first and most obvious characteristic of fiction is that it deals with reality through what can be seen, heard, smelt, tasted, and touched. And one way that I get to the senses is by keeping notebooks and recording everything, which is, I guess, sort of my way of sketching. Um, and I'm blessed with a terrible memory. And I say, I'm blessed with a terrible memory because I know I can't just think, I'll remember that and I can write it down later. That's not going to happen. So I need to take very careful notes and use as much imagery as possible, including things that you can't see, like sounds and smells. This is just a very small portion of my notebook pile. This is a very small portion. Um, so I'm going to now take you through a couple of stories that I started working on during that sabbatical in 2010 that came about from the notes that I took. And after many years and many, many drafts and many, many rejections, some of them, a few of them eventually turned into published stories. And here's my notebook that I kept during that time on sabbatical. Um, and some of the notes that I took, here's one that says, story idea. A couple walking on the Promenade des Anglais, and one says they should wade into the Mediterranean. So that's not really a story. Not yet. And then here's another note I haven't used yet. As we were walking up the Grand Prix Highway under the hot blue sky and castle type mansions, Troy said, I just saw Hugh Grant drive by in a green Ferrari. Anyway, he actually did. I missed that. I have not used Hugh Grant in a story yet, but it could happen. So my husband and I spent a few days in Nice before I spent those 4 weeks in X. I didn't want to write that story about me and my husband having a perfectly nice time. And also, I don't write memoir, so I wasn't going to write about us. So I had to ask myself more of the same kind of questions that I showed you earlier and figure out whose story this is. So, who are these people in Nice? Are they honeymooners? Are they a long married couple going through problems? Is this about their relationship getting stronger? Is it about the breaking point in their relationship? And none of that interested me at all. Like I felt like I could see it all unfolding, and I just it wasn't interesting. So then I thought, what if they're middle-aged siblings? Why would middle-aged siblings be in Nice together? I had no idea. The other ones I could start to figure out, but the middle-aged siblings, I have no idea. So that's the thing I wanted to find out. And so that's the story I started to write. And thinking about who doesn't want to be there. So I came up with middle-aged siblings, a brother whose sisters had a nervous breakdown and needs his help. But there's also another character in my head, a teenage girl from X. So I had to think about point of view and how people who are in the same place, the same setting, are going to experience that place differently based on who they are. And that's what I sort of mean by combining different elements of fiction to get different tones. The point of view is going to affect the setting itself. So here's an exercise from John Gardner. John Gardner's The Art of Fiction. Describe a building as seen by a man whose son has just been killed in a war. Do not mention the sun, war, death, or the old man doing the seeing. Then describe the same building in the same weather and at the same time of day as seen by a happy lover. Do not mention love or the loved one. And I've used this in my classes. I tell them there's a lake out by the student union. And I say, imagine, like, describe that lake from the point of view of someone who is having a terrible day. Don't mention that they're having a terrible day. Describe it from the point of view of somebody who's having a wonderful day. Same weather, everything the same. Don't mention that they're having a wonderful day. And of course, what becomes most interesting to the students are the person who's having the bad day, because there's conflict there and there's things to figure out. So that's been a pretty interesting thing to try. So one of the places that my husband and I went to and had a delightful time was the bar of the Hotel Negresco. We like to go to hotels we can't afford to stay at and go to the bar. Um, so we went there and I took a lot of notes down to what music was playing. And I put that setting in the story from the point of view of the middle-aged man who'd come to Nice to rescue his sister. So this is how that came out in the story, The Upside Down World. This must be what it's like for Gertrude, like breathing underwater, then surfacing to find the air bright with electricity, then diving again, floating. The bar is dim, with red curtains and white pillars, and in the watery light, he and his sister could be any age at all. What on earth are they doing in this impossible place? A small blonde woman in a black dress is at the other end of the bar, feeding rice crackers to a Pomeranian. A young couple comes in, sits down in a far corner, and begins nuzzling over a guidebook. The stereo is playing I Shot the Sheriff very softly. So that was a song playing in that actual bar, and I never would have come up with that if I hadn't just been taking notes, and I never would have remembered it if I hadn't written it down. So Troy and I also went to the Chagall Museum, and I took lots of pictures and made lots of notes. And then I imagined that from the point of view of the teenage girl, and I made her half Irish. She's a pickpocket. Her mother has died. Um, and I made her a pickpocket because there is this couple at the B&B in Nice who got pickpocketed. And I wondered who would have done that. And then I invented this character. So this is how this museum ended up in the story. The huge paintings in the Musée Marc Chagall are like the fever dreams of sick children. Women with flowers for bodies, flying through the air, bare-breasted, under swan wings, crimson horses curled up with violet goats and golden birds, elongated men and women tilting their heads, smiling, big-eyed, long-lashed horse people, humans and beasts in red and violet, floating through an indigo sky. When Elodie was 7, her mother presented her with a copy of Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There. And Elodie smudged all the mirrors in their house with her nose and fingers, trying to push her way through to that other world. Now she is standing just as close to one of the paintings. So something else that happened in Nice was we saw the aftermath of a car accident. And this is what I wrote down in my notes. We heard sirens, and a crowd was gathering on the Promenade des Anglais as we made our way back. I saw a woman's barefoot, black sandal beside it, and then I saw the smashed window of a car, and the driver, a woman, seemed hysterical. Do you think she's all right? I asked Troy, and he said, when you smash up a windshield, you aren't all right. And then this is how it turned into the story, and this is quite near the end of the story. Maybe she's okay, says Elodie. You don't smash a car windshield like that and end up okay, says Ted. A death, Elodie thinks, a death. But she is also thinking, as her heart sparks with an electric hum, that the cruise ships in the bay are oblivious and the joggers are barely stopping. And now even the old couple, the woman with her hand covering her mouth, is moving on. The sky is the blue of a Chagall angel, the sun a yellow goat floating. So here's another story. It got its start in Arles during my sabbatical. And then a few years later, I came back there with my husband and took more notes. And this is what's turned into one of the stories in my newest collection. Um, and this is the draft. This is after many, many years of drafts and revising. And I looked at I keep track of where I send things out. And this story that ended up in the journal and then in the book, it got 7 rejections, which is hardly any. So um, here's the beginning of this story. I guess we're supposed to feel something, Patricia says, staring at a Van Gogh painting of the Rhone as they stand next to the Rhone. Or think something, Charles corrects gently. Well, I think I feel hungry, she says. They are, as the walking tour brochure has promised in 5 languages, following in the footsteps of Van Gogh. All over Arles, there are easels of Van Gogh paintings in front of the things they depict. In front of the night cafe, for instance, which was full of tourists this afternoon under the yellow awning, or now starry night over the Rhone. Such lovely lights on the water, Patricia says, trying to muster up something in the way of awe. This is difficult partly because it's a clammy summer day, and partly because of the crowd of loud American students disembarking from a nearby bus. Well, you can't get away from tourists in a tourist town, Charles says, ducking a bearded boy's outstretched iPhone. Since when are you an expert on tourist towns? Patricia does not say. Neither of them has been to Europe before, or even west of the Mississippi River. So here's a pile. Sometimes this is what it takes to get one story. Sometimes this is one story. um, so I'm always reading, working on at least 5 things at once. Probably more. I'm saying right now, probably 7 to 10 things at once. And some of them will eventually turn into stories, and some of those eventually will get published. So by working on so many things at once, I can always, if I get stuck, I can just put it away and bring out something else. There's always something I'm in the editing phase of, or the just trying to figure out generating ideas, character ideas from, all different stages. Um, so, like I said, if I'm very lucky, a couple of those 7 to 10 things might end up getting published. And I was very lucky that a couple of them did. So both the Upside Down World story got published. It's not in a book, but it is in the O. Henry Prize stories. And then Starry Night ended up in the collection. Um, Another big part of my writing process is reading, a lot of reading. And this is an example of a story by Edward P. Jones. And his collection, Lost in the City, takes place in Washington, D.C., and it's fantastic. Um, he talks in the introduction about being inspired by Dubliners. And anyhow, this is the beginning of a story called The Butterfly on F Street. The man Mildred Harper was legally married to for 21 years had been dead and buried 5 months when, standing on an F Street traffic median, she came upon the woman her husband had lived with for the last 2 years of his life. Mildred had crossed to the island from Morton's, going to Woolworth's, her eyes fixed upon a golden yellow butterfly that fluttered about the median. A child swatted half-heartedly at the butterfly, which rose as high as 7 or so feet at moments, zigzagging back and forth all over people's heads and around advertising kiosks and around the small, lifeless trees. Then the butterfly set off into the traffic, heading toward 13th Street. It astonished her to see such a thing, wild, utterly fragile, in the midst of the buildings, the noise, the cars and buses, and she figured the thing must have lost its way. Before long, the butterfly was consumed in the colors of 13th Street. So I just love that description. It's just imagistic and so precise. And another story collection I really love, oops, is Kali Fajardo Anstein's Sabrina and Karina. So her family has lived in the Denver area for generations, and that's what she writes about, that particular setting. And she said that she hadn't read stories that take place there, especially about women, Latina and Indigenous women from this area. And since those stories didn't exist, she decided to write them. So this is from the very beginning of her story, Sugar Babies. Though the southern Colorado soil was normally hard and cakey, it had snowed and then rained an unusual amount that spring. Some of the boys in my 8th grade class decided it was the perfect ground for playing army. They borrowed shovels and picks from their father's sheds, placing the tools on their bicycles, bicycle handlebars, and riding out to the western edge of our town, Saguarita, a place where the land with its silken fibers pressed firmly to the pillow, a golden blonde by day, a raven-haired beauty by night. The first boy to hit bone was Robbie Martinez. So these books, I just want to give a plug for these great story collections. They are fantastic. Okay, so I've come back to this slide because I've actually returned to this field in a story 14 years after I was there. I found myself thinking about who lives in this house. And maybe it's an American girl with her French father. Maybe her mother is gone, or is she dead, or is she missing? And this girl looks out and sees art students in the fields. And what happens if she goes out and starts talking to them? So one thing you can't see from the slide that I only know because I was sitting there in the grass is that there are teeny tiny little snail shells or something clinging to those weeds. And those teeny tiny snail shells are in the story. So this experience, it just keeps on giving. And I just found out just a few weeks ago that the story it was just accepted by Mississippi Review. They have an art issue and it's going to be in there 15 years after I sat there in that field. So, yeah, I never run out of stuff. Okay. So here's some things I'm working on now. I finally made it to Venice. Just seeing everyone's paintings of Venice, I finally had to see it for myself. And so I'm starting some Venice stories. Those will probably simmer for a couple of years, but that's one thing I'm working on. I'm also literally writing about my own backyard, although I guess this is my front yard, because there are stories everywhere. And for those years when I couldn't go anywhere, I had to look close to home, and I would just walk around the block and just think up weird stuff. So one of the weird things I thought about, one of the weird things I came up with, this came out not too long ago in American short fiction, and this is the beginning of this story called The Invisible Lady. It took less time than you'd think for someone to discover the invisible lady's body. A dog walker tripped over her, his dog stopped to sniff and then took off into the street where it was nearly hit by an SUV driven by a sorority girl coming home at 6:40 in the morning, still drunk from the previous night. The dog walker was now calling the police. The dog was in the middle of the street barking. The sorority girl was hyperventilating, and the invisible lady's husband was waking up to discover his wife was gone. So I will stop there. Oh, and I think I stopped sharing my screen. Okay.
You did.
So,
Thank you,
all right.
Becky.
Thank you. So I'd be
So
happy to
wonderful.
answer questions.
Thank you so much for that. That was so beautiful to see a peek into your process and hear some of your stories. Yes, we can open it up for questions now. If anyone has questions, feel free to just sort of raise your hand like this and make sure to unmute yourself because you're all muted to keep the background noise down. Any questions right off the bat for Becky? Go, Kathleen.
Hi, everybody. Hey, Becky. Becky, that was a thrill. I took, I think, 6 pages of notes. I could ask a million questions, but one thing I've always noticed in your work and that you were talking about tonight was setting. And so, why do you think particular settings resonate with you? What is it like if you had to explore that? Why is it that some places inspire you and to take more notes and make it into your stories?
I think when places are new to me, I definitely take a lot more notes. Like the longer I live in a place, the less I notice about it. Like when I was growing up in Maryland, most I could not think, I wasn't going to write about Maryland. That was so boring. And then when I moved to Tucson, it was suddenly like, oh, actually, no, I could write about Maryland. And then the longer I lived in Tucson, the harder it got to write about that because I was just
Mm.
stuck in my own, problems or whatever brain. Um, so I think it's that combination of like the newness and then sort of working your way past that. Like I've been in Mississippi for good grief, 23 years.
Yeah.
Um, and but I still find stuff to write about. It's harder. I've had to become a better and sneakier eavesdropper. But there's still lots of material. But I've realized like I can't just rely on traveling to find something to write about. That's ridiculous. I gotta just
Mm-hmm.
like talk to, or like if I have a friend telling a story, I'm like, well, that's weird. Can I use that in a story? And they always say yes. So sometimes it comes to that.
All right. So sort of a little bit of the narrative distance or even just the experiential distance. It provides some texture that inspires you.
That's really well said. Thank you. Yes.
All right. Thank you so much, Becky. Loving this. I'll leave it to somebody else.
Yes. Dan, do you want to go ahead? You just have to unmute yourself.
I have kind of a boring, perhaps granular question, but I'm fascinated by all your note taking. And I wonder two things. Do you just sit there with your notebook wherever you are, or do you have kind of a secret method of doing it? And also, how do you organize your notes? Do you have a system for your notebooks? Like what you use for what, or to keep it all, dated or deep by topic, or how do you handle your note taking?
That's good. It's good to see you, Jan.
Yeah.
So notes, yeah. What I do is like I have a ton. I get these by the boxes. These
Yeah.
little blank page things, and I just sometimes I just plant myself down, and just write. Like it's sometimes I feel very rude because my husband and I will go out somewhere, and I'm like, just a second, and I'll just write for 10 minutes. Like, sorry to be rude, but the people at the next table are having a very interesting conversation. I once overheard a couple. When I do travel, I spend a lot of time at the Atlanta airport, like missing flights or whatever. But I once overheard a couple talking about eavesdropping on another couple while I was eavesdropping on them. And I had to write that down. I don't know. But yeah, and so I just take these and just sit and write. I write down things I overhear. They're in like a pile. I stick them in a box, or This is like, I just stacked this on the kitchen chair. Like files, things I'm working on.
But do you date them or something? Like when you say like, you know, a project, you might go back to something 8 years later, like, and you've got this pile of notebooks. How do you?
I do date them, and I'll usually put like, this says Roanoke, because I wrote this when I was visiting my family, or this has got a little Italy stamp on it, so I know it's Italy, and I'll write the date inside. But I don't keep them organized. I just sort of throw them in a pile and then dig through the pile occasionally.
Sounds like something I could work with. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'd like to raise a question if I can. I'm sorry I'm not visible. Becky, I've been a fan of your work ever since Kathleen gifted me your collection, Strange Weather. And I
Thank
loved it.
you.
Hi, Kathleen. I'm glad to be on. I had some trouble getting on, but my question is, I just adore what you read, the Invisible Lady. How did that start? What did you feel or see that got that going?
Well, it was during lockdown times, and I was just stuck at home, and I don't like walking around the block usually. I like to go to the gym and just like watch Netflix and then leave. But I was sort of stuck. I had to, if I was going to get any exercise, I had to go outside and walk around the block. And as I was walking around the block, I was just like, I was listening to murder podcasts, and I just was thinking, like, what if somebody died, but they were invisible? Like, I just let my brain go to, and then I imagined like where, as I was walking down the street, where the body would be. And so it was just because I was stuck walking around the block. And then I had to figure out, well, who is narrating this story? It turns out there's a first person narrator who pops in soon after that. And why is she there? And what's her connection to the Invisible Lady? And just sort of worked from there. So it kept me busy when I couldn't go anywhere.
Thanks.
I started a bunch of other stories, but that was the only one that made it through.
Can you remind me where that's located? I'd love to read it. Where is that?
It's in American short fiction.
Thank you.
I think it just came out like 2 issues or 1 issue ago.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thanks for your question.
Alan, go ahead.
If we take that beautiful paragraph from The Invisible Woman, how, after you've taken all your notes and after you've gotten it all together, how did that come into being? Did you write that immediately and it just worked? Do you work that paragraph? Do you work that section after you've already written a whole sort of story? How did that beautiful thing happen?
I think I had the first line in my head, like it took less time than you would think to discover the Invisible Lady's body. I came up with that, and I pictured in my mind where it would be, like on my street. And but yeah, at first it was going to be like a sort of omniscient point of view. And then as I kept writing, I realized it was a first person point of view. And I did have to go back and, like, I can't just write something straight through. Like, I definitely had to go back to the beginning and then tweak that a little bit. And then even after it had been accepted, the editors were like, here's some changes that could make it a lot clearer. And I was very grateful for that. So yeah, I did rework the first paragraph. I think the first page is, I mean, it's like the most important page. Like, if nobody wants to read the first page, then forget about it. So I do go back and read it out loud a lot and work that. Yeah, so that it went through many drafts, even just that first paragraph and first page.
But after you've done the whole story, or do you work that first page, get it more or less right before you write the whole story? Or you see what I mean?
I try to get it as right as I possibly can, just so I have enough to keep going. But then after I've written the whole story, I always go back to the beginning, and there's always something that needs to be fixed or doesn't connect with what I ended up writing. So I guess both. Like, yeah.
Just one more question. So when you do that, does it ever happen that after you write the story, the first page becomes the last page, or the last page becomes the first page, or you see what I mean? It's
I do
things
see
like
what you mean. And probably, yes. I think that has happened before. Because like there's definitely times when the first page ends up, I just cut it. I just cut it because it was like working my way up to what was really about or something interesting or so I've done that where I've just cut the first page and cut the last page, like and what's left is like the stuff that was in the middle. It's like writing a poem. I teach poetry and I like write bad poetry, but I think it's really useful to do that because you have to be so precise and you can't waste time explaining. Like you just have to start in with something. So I found that to be really useful. And I tell my students like, cut the first stanza, cut the last stanza. And it works for stories too.
Thank you.
Claire, did you have a question? Yeah, go ahead. You'll just have to unmute yourself.
Hey, Claire.
It's usually right there at the bottom. It'll say audio, and you just click on that little audio. There you go.
Hi, Becky. Thank you. That was a
Hey.
really interesting talk and inspiration. I'm curious, like when you're in that process and you've got some inspiration and some ideas and you're asking all those questions, are you kind of coming up with like a sort of synopsis for the story? And if you are doing that, do you sort of stay with that before you launch into actually writing the story, or do you just do you not need to have like a sort of semi synopsis before you dive in?
I don't have a synopsis when I dive in. Like as I keep writing, I had to figure out like I start to realize like at least where it's going to end, or like at least how like the time period, is this going to end this same day or like 2 days? Like I start to figure that out like pretty quickly, and then like what's going to happen over the course of those days. So usually I just have to trick myself into writing and not think about.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes I don't even finish the story. Like sometimes one time I wrote 40 pages of nonsense. It was just, there was hardly any plot. My husband is great because I can read stuff out loud to him and he's really good. And he was like, after the second page, he's like, I don't even know what's going on. And I was like, I know, it's terrible. So sometimes it doesn't work when I trick myself into just writing, but usually I have to start to come up with something that I know they're going to do, or I have like an image, or they're going to end up just like they're going to have lunch together, like or something like that's going to happen in the story. Or then as I write, I'm like, wait, how did this character get there? Do I need backstory? If I don't want to get stuck in backstory, how do I work that in? So at some point I need like some structure, but not
Yes.
at first.
And my other question is like when you're in that process of you're asking questions, and so you're waiting for those answers to drop in, do you tend to sort of like be going on walks, hanging out the washing, or like are you still, or are you kind of in motion, or can it just be anywhere where when you're in that sort of like allowing the answers to drop in?
I have to, because I am so like because I like get so caught up in like grading papers for most of the day. The only time I can write, I used to get up at 5 to write, and now I've moved it to 4:52. I needed that extra 8 minutes. I mean, I go to bed super early. Like I need sleep, but that's when like I have to get up, drink the coffee, feed the cat. It's dark outside. And that's when I start figuring stuff out. Like that's when my brain is working, and that's when I can give all of it to my brain. 'Cause I'm not checking email. I don't want to know what's going on in the world. I don't care. I'm just gonna have that time. So that's
First thing in the morning. That's great. Thank
first
you.
thing. Still dark out.
Becky, I have a question for you. When I read short stories, I'm always so curious how writers decide when to end a short story. It feels like sometimes they end abruptly and you really want to know more, or sometimes they end and it feels sort of settled. How do you decide when a story is done? When is it ended?
I don't know most of the time. Like I'll write I'll write 5, 10 endings. Like I don't know. Like at some point, like I said, I need to have some idea of like where it's going to end, or an image or a moment. It's going to end on this moment. With the people like driving away from each other or sitting at a table together or something like specific. And then I'll try that out. And sometimes it works. Again, sometimes I really just have to, I overwrite it, and then I just have to chop off the last page or the last half page. But it's hard. Ending stories is hard. And I'll read it out loud, and sometimes I'll feel like it's the end of the story, and then I'll realize it's not. So it's just, and that's when poetry actually comes in really handy for ending stories, because you can't just explain what a poem is about. Like you got to be succinct and rely on imagery. So I found that to be useful. Just like if this were a poem, what would be the image I would end on? So
beautiful.
But it's hard. It's hard.
Thank you. Laura, did you have a question?
Yes, hi. I'm new
Hi.
to Marchutz. I am a student of Nick Cruz-Velleman, and I'm a beginner
Wonderful.
artist, beginning stages. But this is fascinating because I have 180 books on my Goodreads app that I want to read. So I do a
Oh.
lot of reading as well. I did a dissertation, so I did a little bit of writing. I haven't done a lot since then, of course. But I did commute to DC. I'm in Maryland for 44 years and was near F Street, so that resonated with me. But I have to share with you, I've coined this, that women are invisible. We have a superpower. Women over 50 were invisible.
Yeah. I know, it's true. I totally agree with you. I found that to be the case. You just slip right, you just like walk right. Nope. Nobody says you're there. Yeah.
No, and I like the superpower because we can go in and out of places without being noticed and so forth. So I'm very content with that new label I put on myself, being invisible. But
I'm with you.
I think of your notebooks in relation to my sketchbooks for sketching, and I need to do more of those, of course, sketching daily. I haven't got into that practice, but I hope to. But I really enjoyed your talk today, and it's giving me a lot of things to think about that maybe I should start writing a little bit again.
Yeah, write and sketch. Why not? Get one of those little sketchbooks and write and draw pictures.
There you go.
I've tried to sketch in these, but it's a disaster. It was like not helpful.
Hey, Rose, is that a friendly person down there, Ander Monson? Do we know him or her?
I'm sure we do. I don't know what their background picture is, but they just joined, so all good. Any other questions for Becky?
I'll ask one more.
Go for it, Kathleen, and then Kate, it looks
okay.
like you have one too.
Oh, well, I'll let Kate go first then. I already got to ask one.
Thank you.
Kate!
I just wanted to say what a treat, what an incredible treat, and thank you to Kathleen for posting about this event. It was really amazing to hear about your process, and I also took tons of notes because I felt very inspired.
So good to see you.
I know it's been so long. It's been so long.
Yeah, thank you to you all for coming. So great.
I wanted to ask, I feel like your whole process is like seeing everything new, but the process of seeing is like a muscle that you've exercised over the years, and it's like something that you're very familiar with, and all of the senses that you would need are all alert and awake. And I was wondering what it's like as you introduce this to students, whether they are able to sort of enact the tricks and tools that you use, and how that works for them, and whether it's something that has to grow.
I think you're right. I think it does take practice, but I do, yeah, I mean, I'll give an assignment. It's like, just go out in the world and write down something that you see. And I give each of my students at some point during the semester, I buy these by the box and I give them to each of my students and I say, do something with it or not. I don't care what you do with it. Just and some of them have come back and they're like, I filled this up. Can I have another one? I'm like, yes, you may. So I do try to get them to like, just write down something you wouldn't think about. Just go to the student union and eavesdrop on people. Like, you're going to learn stuff. And then I'll say, like, come back and tell me what you overheard. Or I'm sitting outside with one student and I was like, look over there, there's a turquoise porta pot. Write about that. There's always something. But yeah, I mean, that's my goal. And it works or it doesn't. But that's, yeah, I think it does take a lot of, and for me too, like it takes effort to notice things actively. So I do try to do a lot of that, knowing that most of what I'm writing about isn't going to end up in a story. It's just practice. So yeah, I try to get them to do that as well.
You're awesome. Thanks.
It looks like we have a few more questions. Dan, why don't you go first?
Hey, Becky.
Dan,
How's it
so
going?
good to see
Excuse me,
you.
I have a terrible cold right now, but
Oh.
it's really nice to see you. And I talk about you in all my short story writing classes because I've always thought you have one of the best attitudes toward writing and just doing it and putting it out there and getting rejected and doing it again.
How it goes.
Yeah, so I've always really been admired that, been inspired by that. I'm amazed that you can keep 5 to 7 projects going at the same time. And is it just that you feel, oh, I want to work on this one today, or I want to work on that one today? I think I would never finish anything if I did that. How does that work for you? And one of the questions I had, what kind of got answered was, did you actually whip out your notebook at that Shishi bar in France?
Yeah.
You did?
Oh yeah. I have the notes. I have the notebook. Yes. Yeah. I had the little portable notebook and then I tore out those pages and put them in the bigger notebook. So yeah.
So your husband just knows. Order a drink and Becky might get out her notebook.
I'm like, you order the drinks, I'm taking notes. And he's like, okay. But yeah, I mean, like, just as an example, like when I work in the kitchen, like I do really have like, these are all folders with stories. So I've got like 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 right just here that I can just pick from every morning because it's too easy for me to run out of steam and get stuck on something. And then the only way to get unstuck is I have to go to something else. And like, of that 7, 2 I probably won't finish. Maybe 1 will get published, but I gotta like give them all a chance. And I think for me, it's mostly just because I'll just get stuck and I have to find a way to unstick myself. So I'll just go to something else. But,
and what about when you're revising something? You don't have to just lock in and.
Yes, that I do have to lock in. That it's like, so what I do every day, actually, this is kind of ridiculous, but I have to write down, I keep a notebook where I write down what I did like every single day. On Tuesday, I worked on this story and I read this story. And so I'll like, sometimes it'll just say edited this story. But I have to like, I feel like I have to hold myself to doing something writing related every day, even if it's just read one story that somebody else wrote. And just stay focused on that. But yeah, there are times when it's like, I'll spend 2 days just editing something as it gets closer to like, okay, this is going to finish. I'm going to finish this. There's something here. I got to just concentrate on that. So does that answer your question, sort of?
Yes.
Jan, I think you had your hand up for a question. Is that right? Go ahead and unmute yourself. You're on mute now.
I'll be quick because,
there you go.
But I just wanted to thank you and to say this was really inspiring from particularly the seeing part for me, the seeing part, which I think is so in keeping with the Marchutz school, and also the the taking notes part. So thank you.
Dan?
And then Sharon, did I see that you had a question? Go ahead and unmute yourself there.
I hope y'all can hear me. Most of my Zoom screen went away for some reason. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. And I just wanted to echo that, gosh, this has been very inspiring. I really like that you take all those notes and all those notebooks. I jot down notes in my sketchbooks, although I don't make full use of them the way that you do. And I had a question. You talked about you have a story. I'd like the reminder of where it's going to be, the one that's set in X that mentions the little snails. Because that has resonated for me each first time. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm stepping on snails, and they're everywhere, and it's just a part of the whole experience. So I'd really like to find that story when it's available.
Yeah, it's coming out in the Mississippi Review. They have an art issue. So
that sounds great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I don't know when it's coming out. Next spring. I think in the spring.
Okay.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty cool too, an art issue.
Yeah, we'll get our hands on that, Rose.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And congratulations, and thank you so much for this.
Thank you.
Any last questions before we wrap up today? Kathleen, did you have another question for Becky?
Well, Kate kind of asked what I was going to ask, so. I'm
good. Well,
Just
wonderful.
before
Thank you so much. Oh, go ahead, Kathleen. Oh, Barry, you've got a question. Go for it.
Yes. This group would obviously understand your interest in Flannery O'Connor. But can you be specific about her writing, her style, her passion, her values? What's coming through for you?
Well, I mean, I love what she writes about with her craft in Mystery and Manners. But her stories, I mean, one of my favorite stories is A Good Man is Hard to Find, because every time I read it, it still gets me by, even though I know there's going to be a misfit and it's going to end horribly. It just starts off so funny. And so, and Good Country People, like she talks about that in Mystery and Manners, not knowing how it was going to end until 13 lines before it ends. And then anyway, so I just think I admire what she says about her writing, and just the way her stories unfold, the way she gets away with stuff with her characters that I couldn't get away with mine. I tell my students, you cannot kill anybody off at the end of the story. You're not Flannery O'Connor.
Oh, and by the way, Dolly Parton gets up at 2:30 in the morning to write her song. So
Whoa.
You might want to move up your
I might need to. She can have that. I don't know.
That's a little early.
Yeah, that's still night. I mean, that's not even, yeah.
Thanks,
Those are
Barry.
your fate stories too, Ellen. The Flannery stories. Before Rose signs off, I just want to say thank you to each and every one of you. Most of all, my dear beloved Becky. That was just so beautiful. And just a special little shout out to my University of Arizona peeps, Dan, Kate, and Patrick, for coming. We just love seeing you guys. Loved seeing you all.
So great
Thanks,
to see
Kathleen.
everybody. Thank you all for coming to this.
And thank you so much, Becky, for taking the time to put together such a beautiful presentation. It was wonderful, and we really appreciate you being our featured artist this month. And we'll have your stories and everything up on our website for a few more days now until the beginning of October. So everyone can head to our website to read a few excerpts. And this will be recorded, it is recorded, this Zoom call. So feel free to share it with your friends and your networks. It was so beautiful. Thank you, Becky.
Okay, thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Mary.
Ciao, everyone.
Ciao.
Thank you.
Ciao.